Mhm.
Okay, welcome again to the Explaining History podcast. Those of you that have been listening recently will know we did had an amazing conversation with Jean Phaelzer a couple of weeks ago on the history of California as a slave state. It was such a great conversation that we've decided to continue it and to talk about some of the areas of the book that we didn't get a chance to talk about previously. So we're going to begin by exploring an aspect of the history of slavery in California during the pre-Civil War years from 1850. Um, the impact of the Fugitive Slave Act on California. So, Jean, perhaps you can talk us through a little bit about this and what the Fugitive Slave Act did in California.
Well, thank you. Thank you for continuing our conversation. It was great. And we stopped really right in the midst of the legalization of slavery in California. Before that, with the missions, the Spanish Empire, in effect, legalized slavery because they were an empire. They controlled the state, and there were no legal challenges or court system to challenge the Spanish kidnap and control and forced conversion of California Native Americans. By 1850, California is going to become an epicenter for its own form of slavery for African Americans. So let's start there. The gold rush happens in 1849, and there was a convergence of African Americans in California, people who actually didn't, as I understand it, expect to discover themselves there. Enslaved Black people, plantation workers, are more common notion of slavery in the United States. Were transported across the plains by slave owners, plantation owners, who in fact would control the early political apparatus of California.
Yeah.
Plantation owners dominated the Constitutional Convention that would set up California as a state. Peter Burnett, the first governor of California, held hundreds of slaves back at his plantation in the South. The first senator from California, William Gwin, was also a plantation owner, and he held 200 slaves back in Mississippi. So this is the power structure of California. Gold is discovered in 1849, 1848. By 1849, it's spread across the world. And African Americans, free Blacks, want to come to California for the same reason that everybody else from all over the world wanted to come to California.
Yeah, you got. I was just going to say, part of almost like the foundational myth of the United States of America is this kind of rugged individualism, the pioneering prospect to finding wealth in the ground, ground that belonged to somebody else previously. That's always glossed over. But this kind of foundational, every country has its own foundational myth or foundational fantasy. And when you examine it, it's normally, wildly untrue. But here we have this idea of the noble pursuit of wealth by the rugged individual, and really, slavery is deeply entwined within that, and exploitation.
Of course, and the myth, of course, of individualism is that myth sat on top of tremendous millions of enslaved Blacks. They weren't perceived as individuals. They had no individual civil rights. They didn't have a right to their family. They didn't have a right to their own sexual or reproductive body. So the myth of individualism sits atop of a enslaved community
Yeah.
in terms of the South. Meanwhile, in the North, free Blacks also wanted to come to California. They wanted to come to California for the same reason people from all over the world wanted to come. There was also the wind at their back was the 1850 National Fugitive Slave Act. And the Fugitive Slave Act said that if you cross a state line to flee, then you are available to be seized, sold, returned to the South, and enslaved.
Yeah.
Even if you were not formally enslaved, or if you had arranged for your freedom, your manumission, or if you had successfully fled. I don't know if you saw the movie 12 Years a Slave, but it's the torturous, some people actually call it torture porn, movie of a free Black man, a violinist, who is captured from upstate New York and transported down and sold into the South.
Mm.
And he needs to be able to establish that he's in fact a free man. In the movie, he needs Brad Pitt with stunning highlights and a Quaker to end up on the plantation. Brad Pitt is a carpenter. He understands that Solomon Northup is a free Black, and he spends years trying to get copies of freedom papers so that he can free Solomon Northup. In California, the Fugitive Slave Act didn't work because you didn't flee across a state line for your freedom. You were transported by your owner into California. The legal term they used was that plantation owners brought enslaved Blacks, quote, voluntarily into California, and then they fled.
Okay, so as you were saying, that there's a great deal of surprise amongst many people that there were enslaved African Americans in California.
And California passes its very own Fugitive Slave Act to make it legal. California passes its very own Fugitive Slave Act to make it illegal not to flee across state lines, because plantation owners brought enslaved Blacks with them into California.
Mm-hmm.
The Fugitive Slave Act did several things. And first, it said that it was illegal to flee inside California. You could be seized, you could be whipped, you could be held and transported back. That was also, of course, a free pass to snag free Blacks as well as enslaved Blacks who had also come out for the gold rush. Built within the California Fugitive Slave Act was the Sojourner Act that allowed plantation owners to keep enslaved people for 3 years in California. This had been copied from the East by slaveholders who claimed to need enslaved help when they sold their cotton in the East up to the mills in New England or through the ports of New York. So California isn't inventing this, but I think it really points to where we started, that the tentacles of slavery had deeply split. The tentacles of slavery had deeply reached into the North. And those same tentacles were imported into California to hold on to enslaved Blacks and also to free Blacks who had come to California to escape the Fugitive Slave Act.
So right from throughout the 1850s, California is sort of hopelessly kind of compromised by it's interesting. You have plantation owners in California, wealthy white people in California whose origin is the states of the South.
Indeed, and they take over the state.
Yeah,
they take over the governorship and control the first legislature of the state. So the first laws and the judges who are also appointed, who will hear the cases of enslaved people who run away or fugitive slaves, those courts are also controlled by Southerners who've been appointed by the governor or the legislature. We do want to keep in mind that the first governor, Peter Burnett, and William Gwynn, the first senator, had come via Oregon, where Oregon has just banned all Black people from living in the territory of Oregon. So they've got a lot of racist baggage that they are going to try in every way they can to implement again in California.
Mm-hmm. And so, one of the reasons, I suppose, why California doesn't quite match the model of the South is simply the fact that it's not a kind of it doesn't quite have the same agricultural economy. It doesn't work on the mass production of cotton and tobacco and things like that. But in all other regards, it is kind of run on with the same ideas of kind of racial superiority and also gerrymandering legal systems in order to make the ownership of human beings a legal right.
Indeed, and I think it's important to remember that people in the East saw California as unoccupied and this incredible fertile land. Tobacco and cotton had pretty much destroyed the soil of the South. The South always intended that these new territories in the West, territories that had been seized by taking the top third to half of Mexico, would become slave states. And the image was not industrialism or early industrial capital. It was to extend the plantation system further and further west. Mm-hmm. It instantly does that in Texas. By the time of the gold rush, Texas had 200,000 enslaved Blacks doing cotton, working on cotton. In fact, some plantation owners who cross the plains don't even have to raid their own plantations for enslaved people. They know they can just buy some more in Texas on their way to California. So the idea of field labor, of using enslaved people to fund the new agriculture that they expected from California, mm-hmm. was built in from the get-go. Mm-hmm. The greed for California was stimulated by gold, but the notion from the Southern perspective of, quote, going west was always to extend the plantation economy into the new territories. And that's why we go to war with Mexico, which is to seize the northern third to half of Mexico and transform it into an agrarian plantation economy.
So when we see this kind of very bucolic artwork from the mid-19th century of manifest destiny and this sort of kind of angelic figure pointing westwards, and I forget who the painting's by, but it's quite a famous one, and wagons are going across the plains, and sort of there's some in the background.
And an angel floating overhead.
Yes. You know, this is at the time really about the planned extension of slavery coast to coast.
Indeed. And what happens is that that will be challenged in California, and the leadership of challenging it in California in part comes from free Blacks who are not only transporting or being transported, or the laws of the North are transported west, but the abolitionist movement also travels west.
Mhm.
And most important of that transport of the notion of Black freedom, of Black liberty, comes through the colored convention movement. All over the United States, I was never taught this, even as a historian at Berkeley, that there were thousands of colored conventions across the United States where hundreds of Black people gathered to demand civil rights and, most importantly, to demand freedom and abolition. In California, there were 3 colored conventions, and 2 were right down the block from the State House, to be very much in the face of the legislature, and they were demanding the right to testify. I kept reading these colored conventions thinking, why aren't they talking about freedom? Why aren't they talking about liberty? But in fact, they were, because if you were a free Black and you couldn't testify, you couldn't enter into evidence, one, that freedom was stipulated tepidly in the California Constitution, so slavery was illegal. But also, if you couldn't testify, you couldn't enter into evidence your own freedom papers, your own manumission papers. And it was a noose around the neck of free Blacks to not be allowed to testify. So there is a vibrant civil rights movement that's happening in the AME churches, in the schools, in libraries that were funded, private libraries for Black people because they couldn't use white people's libraries. All of these civic engagements are happening to demand the right to testify. And I had to understand that freedom comes in many packages, and the right to testify was critical. It wasn't a limited legal demand.
And so at the time, and again, you would be forgiven for not knowing this, but you're describing there what must have been quite a sophisticated civic and kind of intellectual culture amongst African Americans in California, unfree African Americans in California. You know, one of the things I think that is often glazed over when we look at, you know, the poor slaves in chains, isn't it awful? That they're actually, these are people with agency, with knowledge, understanding, talent, skills, just like anybody that you would know now. And it's easy to sort of remove that from them, but obviously the evidence suggests that these were really quite pioneering people.
Indeed, there were 3 Black California newspapers within a few years. There were deep correspondence with the abolitionist community. There were Black ministers. There were Black school teachers. Black kids weren't allowed to go to school. And so immediately schools are set up for African American children in California. And as you mentioned, there was tremendous political sophistication and savvy that was transported across the East through the colored convention movement. So people knew what they were about. It's just that free Blacks didn't expect to find enslaved Blacks working next to them up to their waist in mud and muck, mining for gold, except that the enslaved Blacks weren't mining for themselves. They were mining for other people. Very soon, after the gold rush starts, plantation owners realize that what California needs, and this is one way that it does leak with indigenous Californians, Native Americans, is that California didn't have a labor force. There was no labor force in California, and plantation owners realized that the value of the enslaved people they've brought with them is not just that they can dig for whatever little teeny bits of gold might be left, but they've got these working bodies that they believe that they own. And there is a huge system of renting out enslaved Blacks or captured free Blacks, renting them out to farmers, to new industries, to restaurants, to hotels, or to other miners to work for them. So they are using the new Black population to create a labor force. It wasn't ever very big.
So when you come down to it, the kind of the operating kind of logic is all about, as we know, the extraction of labor value for free. And if we look at something slightly different, a different form of enslavement, the use of, and this, obviously is the loophole in the 13th Amendment after the Civil War, the use of prisons and the use of prison labor. What's the story of prison labor in California?
The story of prison labor in California comes right from the beginning. Because of the value of gold, there was all kinds of money floating around San Francisco and Sacramento, Sacramento was the jumping off point to go into the gold fields, into the Sierra Mountains. Everything was crazy expensive. A loaf of bread cost $18. People are walking around with a great deal of money. Some of it's converted into jewelry. During the gold rush, $1.5 billion is annually shipped to the East Coast from the gold rush. So there is a lot of money, a lot of construction, restaurants, boarding houses, mining equipment that are being sold, and there's a lot of petty theft. Gold mining, digging for gold doesn't turn out to be the glimmering utopia that had been promised. And a new state very quickly is coming into being with manufacturing. And there is a great deal of what we would now call petty theft. And there's a great deal of murder. This was a gun-toting people. In fact, enslaved Blacks, for the first time ever, were issued guns to defend crossing the plains. There were arms everywhere. There was money. There was illusions of easy money, and there was crime. Most of it, or a lot of it, was petty crime and the pressure to have a labor force. California has to set up every possible institution, and it has to set up a system of prisons and penitentiaries. What the legislature does in order to set up a penitentiary is it issues a contract for $100,000, which would be millions in today's money, and it gives it to one corrupt contractor, a dude named James Edsel. The money is going to him and to a former Mexican governor of California. And they are told, build us a prison system, stop all of this petty crime. What they do is they take the money and use it to recruit a labor force of convicts. Edsel is given permission to own, not just use prisoners from all the jails across California.
Mm.
And word goes out from the legislature to send all their prisoners to these little towns, to send their prisoners up to San Francisco to Edsel. What he does is he takes two brigs that are floating in San Francisco Bay.
Mm-hmm.
People who had come out for the gold rush, captains and sailors, decide there's a lot more money in gold than being sailors, and they abandon ship. There are 400 abandoned ships in San Francisco Bay. Edsel and some members of the new San Francisco City Council buy up two of these brigs, and they convert them into prison brigs with fetid, nasty, cramped, diseased cells built into the hulls of these brigs. And Edsel floats his brig all around San Francisco Bay for people who've been there. It's hundreds of miles of shoreline around San Francisco Bay. He's keeping the prisoners and their labor for himself. And for example, he rents them out to San Francisco to build a sewage system, to build the roads. And he rents them out to people who are building mansions to work on their mansions. Goodness. Finally, the legislature says, build the darn prison. But he is accumulating incredible amount of wealth by renting out human beings, unfree people. This is the birth of the carceral state in California. This is the birth of convict labor. Finally, under pressure from the legislature, who keeps canceling his contracts, but they don't have anybody else, Edsel implements the contract to build San Quentin Prison, the infamous San Quentin Prison in Marin County across the bay. He doesn't build it on an island because there are quarries full of granite where he chooses to build San Quentin Prison. And he's going to use these prisoners to quarry the granite, which he will also sell all over the bay, using unfree people to the back-breaking work of chopping granite. And finally, he does it. The prisoners have to build their own prison at San Quentin. Because it's a peninsula, it's not an island, it's easy to escape from there. And the prisoners build escape hatches into the prison. They use salt water for the grout. And when they want to, they can just push out a few bricks from this lousy grout and escape. Finally, he uses the prisoners to build a wall, an inept wall, easy to escape. What he does in San Quentin Prison is he builds factories inside the prison walls of San Quentin for his personal profit. And he is allowed to keep the profit. And the warden keeps the profit. Corrupt legislatures keep the profit. The corruption spreads through the new state. There's a furniture factory built in San Quentin, but the most dire, and in some ways the most interesting, is they build a mill inside San Quentin Prison. During these years, California agriculture is getting going, and it's getting going through wheat. Wheat flies around. It has to be shipped in some kind of contained way. The way it's going to be shipped from California is in what we call burlap bags, or bags made out of jute. The fiber for these jute bags comes from Calcutta. So what you have is a very global economy of enslaved people in India growing jute. The jute is shipped from Calcutta halfway around the globe to San Francisco, where it's shipped over to these sheaths of jute. It's shipped to San Quentin Prison, where the prisoners are required to weave these jute bags for the new California agriculture. And there's 1,000 looms in this prison.
Okay.
Think of the enormous mills in the north of England. This is what it must have looked like inside the walls of San Quentin. The prisoners are required to stand for 12 hours a day at a loom without speaking. I could not stand for 12 hours a day, and I couldn't stand for 12 hours a day, and certainly I couldn't stand without speaking for 12 hours a day.
No.
And no one could. And so within San Quentin Prison is designed an elaborate system of tortures. They import from the East kind of waterboarding. They would put a prisoner in a bathtub full of water and send an electric shock into the water. If a prisoner so much as spoke when they were supposed to be standing at the mill, spinning this jute into bags for the new wheat, for the new agriculture, for California, which was going to go east and feed the Midwest and feed the East Coast. So the slavery of convicts becomes a key point in inserting California into this global system of import jute, manufacturing it inside the prison with a steam loom and exporting it. There is a massive strike at San Quentin Prison. We think about Attica and the strike at Attica. 1,000 prisoners inside San Quentin Prison in the 1850s go on strike because of the forced labor, the hunger, the beating, the torture.
Are the prisoners mainly black? Are there any white prisoners amongst them?
The prison population is diverse. Right. There are Native Americans, there are Chinese people, there are women prisoners, a very small population of women prisoners who are forced to live in the houses at first of the warden, so they become sexually available, deliberately sexually available, and then they're kept in the most disgusting, horrible basement of the prison to live. So the population turns out to be Mexican American who were Californians before California became part of the United States. So there are Mexican Americans, Native Americans, Chinese people, African Americans, and white people who are in, the prison system is becomes it's sort of like the military or sports. It's one of these unique, diverse populations. It will, of course, become increasingly African American as the population expands with the Great Migration around World War II.
One of the interesting things about this part of the story is when you look at prison populations and their exploitation in things like the 1920s, 1950s, and now, it's easy to look at these things as kind of, as we tend to, as sort of historical aberrations, as sort of kind of moments of acute injustice. And often we understand about these things through dramatization. But there's a consistent story from the beginning of California. And of course, if you were to extrapolate this to the rest of the United States, no doubt that this was a nationwide phenomena. And so the beginnings of the carceral state to now, where I think it is in America, the largest continuous exploited prison population, not just in the world, but in the history of the world, and that has to contend with Stalinism. To give you an impression of how big that is now, it makes Stalinism look, like an also ran in terms of its size. But this has a kind of a history that dates back to plantation slavery. So it is this twin form of slavery that kind of we don't see, or we don't see quite as clearly, which is, I think, the really, really interesting aspect of what we're talking about here.
I think with Black Lives Matter and the murder of George Floyd, the reality of convict labor and what was happening in the American prison system becomes visible again. And it threads through to modern times where there are factories within the prison. My book, California, a Slave State, has a section on what's happening down at Donovan Penitentiary in Southern California in the Ojai Valley, where it's brutally hot. It's desert. And there they have a T-shirt factory built into Donovan Penitentiary to convicts who are forced to work unseemly hours a day for no pay, with their being guarded, their uniforms, their food, their housing paid by the state for this T-shirt factory to be built inside Donovan Penitentiary. 2 prisoners are able to use their minimal phone time to telephone a television station in Los Angeles and explain what's going on. They're immediately put in other prisons. They're charged, they're convicted, but word becomes out of what is happening in the California prison system through these 2 very courageous men who just couldn't take it anymore. So it's an enduring part of convict labor and the carceral state. The women's prisons up in Northern California are currently required to do the ecologically pure work of taking apart old computers. But we know the toxicity in the dust, in the metals, the chemicals within an old computer without any protective covering. And cancer is running through some of the women's prisons where they are supposedly doing the good work for Sony, for example, in recycling computers. So the evil gets woven with the good and it's make work. There is nothing that's going to be used from these old computers.
No, it's meaningless labor, but also kind of becomes unchallengeable because there's this sort of veneer of greenwashing about it. Of look, we're getting these poor, destitute, and kind of morally bankrupt people who have committed these dreadful crimes because they're poor, to do some recycling, which is very good. It's sort of like getting them to pick up litter, except sort of a bit more advanced.
Why the women are suffering from skin cancers and all kinds of lung cancers from the toxicity of the chemicals in these Sony computers that they're taking apart.
Yeah, and it's again, they are, their labor, because has been kind of stolen. It means that they are the ultimate kind of expendable human being.
They're expendable and they're not released. I mean, the pressure to hang on to them and not release them, to not parole people, is part of that pressure to extend their sentences as long as possible.
And that, there's a whole other kind of there's a kind of this explosion of insane prison sentences from the 1990s onwards, with the three strikes and rule and that sort of thing, was partly motivated by the desire for a huge pool of free labor.
The largest donors to Governor Jerry Brown, who was known as a very liberal governor who actually did a lot for the state, his largest donors were the prison guards. They want to keep the system going and to hire more and more and more guards, rather than putting the money into safer buildings or better food or medical care or rehabilitation.
Wow. That's the implications of that really for what we think about not just America, but the foundations of the system of capitalism that we exist under. Here we are talking through technologies that from different, assembled in different parts of the world, assembled probably in China, perhaps Bangladesh, perhaps even in America. And the question is, under what conditions were they assembled? Perhaps free labor, perhaps well-paid labor, but very probably not. But that kind of almost takes us from plantation slavery to the 21st century, really, through this long journey. And I think, just to kind of draw things to a close a little bit, because we're running out of time, the value of the book that you've written, and California, a Slave State, I urge everyone, I'll put the link in the show notes. Please get this book, read it, support your local bookshop, don't go through Amazon. Support your local bookshop to buy it, because we must support independence. The reason why this is a valuable book, one I've come back to it several times now, is because it allows us to look beyond the kind of the simplistic assumptions that we have about a place, California, about systems, about people, about freedoms, and about the system of capitalism that we exist under, and its dubious present and its exceedingly murky past. And I'm supremely grateful, Jean, to have had you on, twice on the podcast. And perhaps later on we can return again to look at a couple of the other issues that maybe we didn't have time for today. But it's been some wonderful chats that we've had.
Nick, thank you so much for inviting me back. There is more to cover, because, as you say, this is spaghetti. It weaves through the technology, the labor system, the sexual, the reproductive system. Child labor is permeated by how much labor we can get without paying for it out of a human body, and what else we can do to exploit a human body comes from this lack of freedom. I'm truly grateful for this opportunity. Terrific conversations. The book, California Slave State, was published in the UK this week. I think August 22nd it came out,
right,
in the UK. So I know you have a global audience, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to talk about this extremely complicated moment for which there was all.
Fantastic. Jean, let's finish there. And we will definitely be hearing from you again. So it's been, once again, a pleasure and an honor. And I really do wish you all the best with the book.
Thank you so much.
You take super good care. Speak to you soon.
Okay.
Bye.